It's the pinnacle of amateur sports. In less than 1 month, those athletes will be competing for their country in the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. Now, considering Canada's sour relationship with China, should this country be sending athletes? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. The Winter Olympics come every 4 years, and with it, nations cheering on their athletes who put everything on the line for the opportunity to compete. Canada has joined the US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand in a diplomatic boycott of these games. Athletes will still be able to compete. Now, for more than 2 years, Canada and China relations were tattered due to hostage diplomacy of the two Michaels after Huawei exec Meng Wanzhou was detained in Vancouver for the US. China has responded to the boycott with a promise of retaliation, although it's unknown what is referring. To make the situation even more complex, add in the Omicron variant spreading around the world. Now, our poll question asks you, should Canada be sending athletes to the Beijing Winter Olympics? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now. Coming up on the show, John Rowe of the Angus Reid Institute will join us to talk about how Canadians feel about the subject and whether there are other concerns as well. Bruce Kidd, former Canadian Olympian from the 1964 Games, will join us for the athlete's perspective. And former Canadian diplomat to China, Charles Burton, will join us. But first, I am pleased to be joined by Elliot Tepper, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. And Elliot, have Canada-China relations ever been this bad?
Not in modern times. Canada really pioneered bringing China into the fold when we recognized in 1970, the People's Republic of China as the holder of the Security Council seat. And therefore, we broke relations with the nationalists who were actually on Taiwan at that point. We shifted our attention from Taiwan to the mainland. We did maintain an economic and cultural office, unofficially a diplomatic office in Taipei. And they have, of course, a very active office here. But we have made that decision, really led the way. Other countries, including the US, followed shortly thereafter. The formula that we mentioned, we took note of, without saying yes or no, China's position regarding Taiwan as a breakaway province from China's view. So we took note of it, but we didn't comment on it. And since then, there were high hopes, as you may recall. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, of course, did all this. He was a great fan of China, and we have deep, long-standing relations through missionaries in particular with the people of China. But this government of China that we currently are dealing with is different. So we now have a situation since 2007 that things have evolved. Merely 1,000 days plus before the taking of the hostages, before the Meng Wanzhou issue emerged, there were hopes that there would even be a huge new opening to China with the free trade agreement. That, of course, now seems like an ancient memory.
The prime minister feels Xi Jinping's China of today is vastly different from just 5 years ago.
Yes.
Do you agree with that? And if so, how has it changed?
Well, it's changed enormously. Deng Xiaoping, remember the big names we remember here in the West is the founder of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong. I was there I picked up a little red book. Should have brought it up as a prop today. I was there in '74. Mao Zedong really created the country as we know it, but then led it into chaos. That chaos was overcome by a successor, Deng Xiaoping, the other major name we know. And his advice was, hide your strength, bide your time. Yes, we'll grow stronger, but we're not going to scare people with it. The big change is Xi Jinping has come to power. And since then, he has abandoned that policy. We are a superpower. We're going to tell everybody we're a superpower. Wolf warrior diplomacy is going to be our method of operating around the world. He has very strong support in the Chinese tradition in terms of the communists coming to power after, as they put it, a century of humiliation. And now they're into a period of national rejuvenation. And they're saying, we have achieved national rejuvenation under the wise leadership of the party, and me as the center of the party. So therefore, next year, you should cement me as unprecedentedly a third term, basically president for life, leader of the party. So he has really changed things a lot. He's saying no more hide and bide, we're here.
This has led to diplomatic boycotts by Canada, US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Would you consider those a half measure? Do they work? Or is this just, those countries trying to save a little face saying that they've done something, but they really haven't done anything?
Well, Emmanuel Macron of France has said these are, I forget his exact word, irrelevant, insignificant, unimportant, and he plans to go personally. They hope to host the next round of Olympics. So it's a way to say we don't approve of you, but at the same time, let our athletes go ahead and compete. And our athletes are, as you'll hear in a moment from another person, laser focused on the Olympics themselves. The Chinese have put their prestige on the line that they can hold an Olympics in the middle of a Omicron crisis, Delta crisis, and they have a zero COVID crisis policy. They're going to stamp out COVID in their all around, and there's a bubble created. So the legitimacy of the party and the pride of the party is tied up with a successful second Olympics. Only 8 years ago, they had an Olympics. That was the coming out party. Apparently nobody, you'll have to take this up with your sports expert, apparently nobody really wanted to do this again. So they said, we'll do it and we'll do it right. But much more important, and this is something I'd like to underline, he would like this Olympics to be a success. The party's prestige is on the line, but it's far less important to him than the big ticket item, which is coming up at the end of next year, the 20th Party Congress, which will then cement him into this position, assuming he can maintain the legitimacy and stability, legitimacy through stability of the party. He will then have this unprecedented role as a modern Chinese leader.
Now, Canada has a new foreign affairs minister, Melanie Joly, and do you think fresh eyes will bring a new perspective to the relationship?
I don't think so. This is all foreign policy. Ultimately, is the foreign policy of the government of Canada. That means the Prime Minister and the PMO will be formulating this. She has announced that in her mandate letter, which I've read, she's correct. There's now going to be the announcement of a new Indo-Pacific policy. There was a great scoop by the Globe and Mail. Let's finally find out what that is, $3.5 billion. There will be a change in Canadian policy toward Asia, not China, Asia, by calling it an Indo-Pacific policy. This was created as a concept by the Prime Minister of Japan going to India in 2007, addressing Parliament and saying the confluence of two oceans, India on the one side of China and Japan on the other side of China, are now going to work together. And we are now going to join that international consensus, changing our own vocabulary and trying to work with all of Asia. So Canada can now say, this isn't an anti-China policy. It is, but we are not anti-China. We are pro-Asia and diversifying our trade, basically for the very first time, having a framework to take Asia far more seriously than it has in the past as a result of the emergence of China.
Elliot, I want to thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're very welcome. There's always a lot to talk about when it comes to China.
Elliot Tepper is a distinguished senior fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Now, someone who has been part of Canada's diplomatic corps in China is Charles Burton. He's associate professor at Brock University, and he joins us now. And Charles, China calls the diplomatic boycott a farce. Do you feel it is a farce?
No, I don't think it's a farce. I think it's a largely symbolic measure. Chances are we wouldn't have had any ministers in China for the Olympics because of the COVID restrictions imposed by the government of China. And aside from which, at the Tokyo Olympics, we only sent our minister of sport. So, it's not like we were expecting to have a row of senior cabinet ministers making nice with the standing committee of the Politburo while watching the figure skating or something. But on the other hand, it sends out a signal that our government is not prepared for business as usual with a regime which is engaged in such repugnant behavior, both domestically in terms of the genocidal policies towards Turkic Muslims and Hong Kong, and internationally in terms of what China's been doing in the third world, enabling corruption and its territorial expansion into the international waters of the South China Sea. So, I think it was a good thing to do. Of course, I would have preferred that we figured out some way to get the Olympics out of China altogether and hold it, maybe in Vancouver and Seattle or something. But, that definitely isn't happening. And so we'll just have to try our best with, what some Canadian NGOs are referring to as the genocide Olympics of 2022.
I wonder, should Canada and allies have gone further, maybe an all-out boycott, send the message?
I think that would have been the best option under the circumstances. But, there's a lot of money involved in putting on an Olympics. And of course, for a lot of the athletes, one Olympics is their only opportunity to demonstrate their world-class skills. So one can see why it's still ongoing. But I think if we'd taken it a bit more seriously when we first started to get reports of the genocidal policies, which is already 4 years ago that it was confirmed that was going on, that, it would have been great if the international community had got together and made it clear to the International Olympic Committee that they had to find an alternative venue for these Olympics. Aside from which, you wonder really if it's still viable to have the Olympics all in one country at a time. They're very expensive. They lose money, require building a lot of new athletic facilities, which often, go into disuse once the games are over. Maybe we're better off having an Olympic meet that is held in many countries at the same time using existing facilities, because it seems, aside from dictatorships that want to make a showpiece out of these money-losing games, most democratic countries are just not prepared to host because of the cost implications.
Considering the media in China is government controlled, would anything like a boycott or diplomatic boycott even register there? Because it probably wouldn't get to air.
The Chinese have been complaining about it, but mostly in media directed externally. Of course, Chinese people will see that there are some leaders who go there and a lot of respected nations who are absent. There's also the question of whether a significant portion of our athletes will boycott the opening and closing ceremonies. So, if it appears on Chinese TV, these Olympics are largely about the Chinese domestic audience gaining a sense of legitimacy of the authoritarian one-party rule of the Chinese Communist Party. If they saw in the opening ceremonies that the flags were coming in, but there were very few athletes following them, that would certainly send a signal to the Chinese people that there's something seriously wrong in relations between China and the democratic West.
I think back to 2008 and the Beijing Summer Games, and then we look at here in 2022. What's the difference for you in looking at those two different games?
Well, of course, we weren't aware of the genocide aspect, and China's policy towards Hong Kong was still maintaining its international agreement to uphold the freedoms and the democratic promise of Hong Kong. The Chinese government had promised to allow the Hong Kong people to elect their own chief executive. They subsequently reneged on that. And also the Chinese government, in the lead up to those Olympics, made a lot of commitments about democratization and extension of human rights into China, which of course have not been fulfilled. So there seemed to be a notion that maybe the Olympics in China, shining the light of the world on that country, would have a beneficial effect to seeing the Chinese government better respect norms of human rights and democratic governance. I think the fact that after the Olympics were over, the Chinese government started to become more repressive and less permissive about even discussion of things like independent judiciaries and free and fair elections, that sets a bad precedent for this particular Olympics, that we can't expect anything good to come out of it. What we're really doing is affirming a regime that the world regards as a dangerous player in global affairs, and one which doesn't respect the fundamental rights of its citizens that are guaranteed by its membership in the United Nations.
The Huawei decision is still a big one for Canada and China, and it's still on the table. Why is it taking so long?
Well, I think it's because our government there are key elements in our government who are supported by large Canadian firms who have important business relationships with Chinese Communist business networks that don't want to alienate the Chinese regime in any way. And so, our government has said that they're still considering the decision. Well, I mean, we've been looking at whether the Huawei 5G poses a threat to Canadian security, by enabling the Chinese regime to have knowledge of critical infrastructure that would be controlled by 5G, or the ability to access databases of information that would be of use to Chinese espionage. We've been considering that for 3 years. All of our allies have decided that the Huawei 5G is an unacceptable risk to their national security, despite the telecommunication companies wanting to use that technology because it's priced much cheaper than the competitors, Nokia and Ericsson and Samsung and so on. So the fact that Canada is not making a decision on this troubles me a great deal. And I think it causes our allies to feel that Canada is a weak link in the Five Eyes intelligence consortium. And in NATO and our other important security alliances with like-minded nations, there's a fear that, how can you share intelligence with Canada if there's a prospect that the Chinese regime could obtain that critical information, which would be damaging to all. And the United States has made it crystal clear to Canada that if we go with the Huawei 5G, that this will affect their ability to share critical intelligence with us. And that's very bad news for Canada because we're a net importer of intelligence. We need that information to protect our Arctic and southern border. And so, it's just puzzling to me as to why the government is deferring this decision, and really makes me wonder if, on a Friday afternoon before Christmas, they'll announce that they've looked into it and we will be allowing the Huawei 5G to go ahead.
The diplomatic boycott, China obviously not happy about that. Could China retaliate economically to Canada and have an impact?
I think that, China has tried economic retaliation with Australia, directly related to the Australian government's demand that there be an international impartial investigation of the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it wasn't very successful. China started to have shortages of things like coal and iron ore that they largely sourced out of Australia. And the Australians, to their credit, were able to find alternative markets for these export commodities. The global market for these things. So if China's sourcing from somewhere else, it opens up space for countries like Canada and Australia to sell elsewhere. Now, in the case of Canada, unlike Australia, which sends about a third of its commodity exports to the People's Republic of China, Canada is down about 4% of our commodity exports going to China. So I think a lot of Canadians feel that we have a very strong dependence on our exports to China, and therefore we should play nicer with them on ignoring concerns about human rights and other issues, security issues, because, our primary interest in China should be promoting Canadian prosperity through trade and investment. But it's not actually true. And in fact, China sells into Canada 3 times as much as we sell to them. So in theory, we have more leverage. So I think the Chinese government, after their failure of their attempt to use economic coercion on Australia, probably would not engage in that on Canada. Aside from which, there's so many countries that are joining us in the diplomatic boycott that if China does it with one, they have to do it with the others. And that really would be damaging to their economy, which is already suffering enormously from their extreme lockdown measures to try and eliminate the risk of the Omicron variant in that country.
Charles, I want to thank you for joining us.
It's been great to speak with you.
Charles Burton is a former member of the Canadian Diplomatic Corps, as well as a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. At the middle of this riddle are the people for who politics take a backseat. The athletes in 1980 and 1984, the games were boycotted by nations, which broke the hearts of athletes whom had been training for years for that opportunity. Bruce Kidd's a former Canadian Olympic from the 1964 Games in Japan, as well professor of sport and public policy at the University of Toronto, and his new memoir, A Runner's Journey, looking at politics and sports. And Bruce Kidd joins us right now. And Bruce is an amateur athlete. What did it mean to you to go to the Olympics?
Well, in the 1960s, that was the most special event on the entire calendar over a 4-year period. There wasn't the schedule of World Cups and alternate high-profile competitions that there are now. It was the most important, above all, the competition that we had. And I would say for many of the Winter Olympic athletes, that's the case today. It's not the only major competition, but it's so much more important than all the others.
Was it everything, the experience at the Olympics? Was it everything you expected?
Yes, it was. I would say the 1964 Olympics, even though I didn't win the races I wanted to win, changed my life. It taught me about the world and the world of sport, the power of sport, the opportunity to engage in a non-English speaking world. It really opened up so many doors to me that in fact it probably changed my life. If you read my recent memoir, I argue that if it wasn't for the '64 Olympics, I probably would have been a lawyer. Instead, because of what I saw in Tokyo and Japan in 1964, I gradually got into sports studies and forged a career that way.
In your eyes, is a diplomatic boycott a suitable response by Canada, the US, Australia, considering their ongoing conflicts with China?
Actually, I think it does. I mean, we're facing many contradictions. Most of us are horrified by the genocide against the Uyghurs and the other repressive actions of the Chinese state in recent years in Hong Kong, the threats against Taiwan, the treatment of the Tibetans, and so on. But international sport and Olympic sport is intended to reach out to all people, regardless of the human rights practiced or not practiced or not respected in different countries. And so how do you express your horror about what the Chinese are doing, and at the same time go to an Olympic Games that is being hosted by the International Olympic Committee in China? And I think it's not a perfect solution, but I think the diplomatic boycott, in which nation states express their condemnation, but athletes can still compete and hopefully can still express their views in Beijing, is a kind of middle ground. But we're clearly feeling our way on this. As human rights become more important, how do we continue to compete against people or in countries where repression is more the norm? I mean, if I was an athlete, would I want to compete in Texas right now with some of the recent legislation banning abortion, rolling back civil rights in voting, and so on and so forth? These are difficult questions that the sports world is struggling to grapple with. And in the meantime, as the clock is ticking towards the Winter Olympics, the diplomatic boycott is it's not a bad way to go.
This obviously leaves the athletes in the middle. Some feel it should be an all-out boycott. Others feel just a diplomatic boycott, because obviously they've put their time, sweat, tears, everything, 4 years into this. Are the athletes paying attention to the rhetoric around this right now?
They are, and they have been for 2 or 3 years. I'm not directly involved with the Athletes Advisory Commission of the Canadian Olympic Committee, but I know people who are on that body. And I know that as we speak, they are discussing this. They've educated themselves about the issues. They're taking it very seriously.
The IOC claims it doesn't want the Olympic Games to be politicized, but when you think back to 1964, were they politicized for you, or is this just something that's been growing over the last little while?
There were several countries that did not participate in 1964 because of international politics. I think I'm disappointed by the formulation that politics and sport do not mix. An earlier generation of IOC presidents, particularly Michael Kalanen and Juan Antonio Samermanch, would say, of course, politics is part of international sport, but we need to minimize their negative effect so that people from different countries can still compete and communicate peacefully and get to know each other as a way of reducing world tensions. That's the overarching purpose of the Olympics. But to deny that there's no politics in it, that's naive. And I'm sorry that Thomas Bach has fallen back into this old formulation.
Bruce, I want to thank you for joining us.
Ed, thank you for your attention.
Bruce Kidd's a professor of sport and public policy at the University of Toronto, as well as a former Canadian Olympian from the 1964 Olympics and the author of the memoir, A Runner's Journey. Canadians are watching the issue unfold and have several concerns about a diplomatic boycott. John Rose, a research associate with the Angus Reid Institute, and he joins us now. And John, what is the opinion of China by Canadians?
Well, we asked Canadians in November about what they thought Canada should do coming up to the Olympics. And most people were, the majority were supporting a diplomatic boycott, which is what ended up happening after we released the polling. But most people don't really want to keep athletes home. Only 2 in 5 supported athlete boycott of the Olympic Games, which, there are I guess there's still time for that to happen, but that's not what Canadians kind of support. They were more supportive of the diplomatic boycott.
And in terms of the diplomatic boycott, did they feel it was going to, send the message, get the job done, or was it just saying something but not impacting the athletes at all?
Well, and that's the thing. We asked whether or not people believe that there's anything Canada can do to actually change China's behavior on things like this. And most Canadians, 7 in 10, don't believe that anything Canada do can actually impact what China does, what the government in Beijing does. And it's kind of interesting that I guess even though people do want to take actions against China, such as the diplomatic boycott, they are kind of wary whether or not it will have an effect.
And in the effect, there's concerns about the economy, is there not?
Yeah, absolutely. So polling that we released last week, earlier this month, is that they're worried that if they take any actions against China, the majority of Canadians are worried that there's going to be economic consequences. So we asked, or we put out a statement saying, I'm worried about the economic consequences of standing up to China and whether or not Canadians agreed or disagree with that statement. And 58% said that they agree, that they're worried that if we take actions against China, that there will be consequences for us economically.
Now, do Canadians want less China influence on our economy?
That's another question we asked in our polls too, is that whether or not we can trade with China less. And most Canadians, 3 in 5, they want to reduce the amount of trade that we do with China. And we asked them we followed that up with another question with those people that do want to trade less with China, whether or not they believe that's realistic. And most people that think that we can, or that want to trade less with China, actually believe that we can do that without affecting our economy, I guess, by making up those trades elsewhere. And that's actually something that the Trudeau government has come out this week and said that they're looking to try to foster relationships kind of around the Pacific and around that region that aren't with China, as maybe kind of a way to kind of disentangle us a little bit with the Chinese economically.
Kind of the Indo-Pacific strategy, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, and Canadians, I think it's interesting. So one of the poll questions that we've asked consistently is whether or not, like, what should we prioritize in our relationship with China, which is we give them a trade-off of between economic things like trade, investment opportunities, and human rights and the rule of law. And consistently over the last 3 or 4 years, most Canadians, and right now it's 3/4, want to prioritize human rights and the rule of law when we're dealing with our relationship with Beijing. But it's kind of one of those things where whether or not it's tough, because obviously our economy, that's $100 billion worth of imports and exports every year. So that is a significant portion of our trade. China is our second largest trading partner. So it is tough. And I think that's why you also see that Canadians are somewhat conflicted on it. They want to trade with China less, but they are worried that what will happen with our economy if we start taking those kind of steps towards that.
And interesting how, you're sort of getting torn in both ways here. You want less influence, but then you're worried about your, the bottom line. How do you jive the two?
Well, I think it's like Canadians are both, I think they kind of realize, I guess, what both those aspects are. It's one of those difficult things, which I think even the Trudeau government, I think, is trying to figure out, is that how do you kind of approach this where, like, most Canadians recognize and see that, like, much like the Parliament say that there is Parliament identified a genocide happening in China, and was part of the reasons why Trudeau said that they wanted to avoid sending diplomats to the Olympics. Canadians agree with that, but they also, I guess, they see that economic relationship, and it's hard for them to, I guess, look for past that and say, okay, well, how do we kind of start doing that? Whereas, if you go on Amazon and buy things off Amazon, a lot of the things you end up buying off there is from China, right? So it's kind of difficult to, I think it's kind of hard to imagine what a world would look like if we weren't importing $77 billion worth of stuff from China every year.
John, I want to thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
John Rose, a research associate with the Angus Reid Institute. Our poll question asks, should Canada be sending athletes to the Beijing Winter Olympics? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now. I want to thank our guest today, Elliot Tepper of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, former Canadian diplomat Charles Burton, Bruce Kidd, former Canadian Olympian at the 1964 Games in Japan, as well as professor of sport and public policy at the University of Toronto, and of course, John Rowe at the Angus Reid Institute. And I want to thank you for watching The Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.